Good morning. We're just waiting a couple of minutes for everybody to join and then we'll get started. Hello, I'm Eleanor Asplin, Marketing Manager for the Business and Management book list at Sage. I'm a white cisgender woman with light brown hair, brown eyes, and I'm wearing a black top. My pronouns are she/her. I'm joined by Amy Douglas in the background, who is also from Sage, and she'll be running the technology for us. I'm delighted to be introducing the webinar today titled Teaching Digital Business in a Rapidly Evolving Landscape with Dr. Annmarie Hanlon. A bit about Sage before we get started. Sage is a global independent publisher at the forefront of research and scholarship. Our business management textbooks, journals, and learning resources unite theory and practice, offering a full breadth of subject coverage in a diverse range of formats and delivery options to support classroom and research needs. To go over some housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. It will be available to watch on our Sage YouTube channel after the event, and you will also receive a link to the recording via email. Closed captions are available, so please do turn those on if you would find them useful. We have switched off cameras and muted all microphones for all participants except the presenters, just to avoid any background noise. The chat box also won't be available during the webinar. However, there will be a Q&A right at the end of the discussion, so please do add your questions via the Q&A function. Questions were also submitted ahead of time, so if you asked a question via the registration form, Annmarie will aim to answer these if they haven't been answered during her presentation. Any questions that we don't get around to answering today, we will aim to answer after the event and circulate these to you. Today's webinar is focusing on teaching digital business, addressing student concerns and exploring the never-ending release of new digital tools and how this can be managed by faculty. Annmarie will also be drawing on her most recent book, Digital Business. If you haven't got your copy yet, you can get 25% off from sagepub.co.uk with the code on the screen. You can either scan the QR code or visit the URL directly to get your copy. Unfortunately, this code won't work in the US and Canada. Finally, I would just like to introduce you to your speaker. Annmarie Hanlon's pronouns are she/her. She has extensive experience teaching at all academic levels, from undergraduate to master's programs. With 25 years in consultancy before pursuing her PhD, Annmarie now serves as the course director for the Senior Leadership Apprenticeship Programs at Cranfield University. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Annmarie for the discussion.
Thank you so much, Eleanor, for such a fantastic introduction, and you're all very welcome here today in this session. Teaching digital business is an interesting space. I worked in consultancy for many years, and digital for me was about getting things done easier, making it easier, not harder, and removing the need for duplication. And when I moved into academia a number of years ago, I realized that there were concerns about teaching this fast-moving area. So in today's session, what I'm going to do is share with you main concerns teaching digital business, and you may recognize some of this. I'm also going to look at ways you can manage those concerns and how you can respond. We had some questions in advance, and there were quite a few requests for tips and tools about using AI, so I've included this too. And then finally, I'll look at how you can stay ahead. So the main concerns teaching digital business tend to be around this fast-moving world with tools emerging weekly. And there's also a concern that maybe students know more than those that are teaching the subject. And if you're like me, I was born in a non-digital age, so all of these tools are new to me. And how can you stay ahead with so many tools emerging all the time? Well, let's look at ways you can actually manage these concerns. I think the first area to explore is whether students fully understand how digital has changed not just business, but the workplace. Certainly when I remember one of my first roles, one of the receptionist duties in the morning was to go through and to open all the post and to literally write it all down in a logbook. And it was the same with faxes when they arrived. With email, none of that is actually possible. But it does mean that we are suddenly able to communicate with people more broadly and widely and much faster than ever before. But how has this had an impact on our society? And how does this speed of change leave some people behind? Not every business has the budget to be able to go ahead and to invest in either the technology or managing the technology that exists. And this is something students need to appreciate as well. And there's also the ethical issues. These tend to come as a runner-up. Ethical issues are something that tend to be considered once the genie is out of the box. If we think about driving and cars, historically, when people drove cars, there were no safety belts. You could consume alcohol and drive, and this was then discovered to be dangerous. And suddenly, safety belts were introduced. Drink driving legislation was introduced, and the legislation tends to follow some time afterwards. And there are concerns in the area about ethics and AI, but these are being addressed more broadly at this moment in time. It's worth understanding as well, if a student says, oh, have you seen this, or have you seen that, or are you using this tool, or what do you think about this? It's understanding, well, where did they get the evidence about this tool? Where did it come from? What were their information sources? Is this just within their own little group, within their own filter bubble? And we know that filter bubbles are alive and well and working successfully, probably on X, formerly Twitter, more so than anywhere else. And the more you look at a particular subject, the more content you gain on that subject, mainly because the algorithm thinks it's an interest and it's something that you're passionate about. There isn't yet an algorithm that enables you to say, I'm curious about this, but that doesn't mean I support it. Maybe that will come later on. But as professors, you understand much more. You understand about legal issues. Fraud online is rife, whether it's selling fraudulent goods or fraudulent people. And I'm sure students will have heard of the notion of catfishing, which is this whole dark area of dating deception which exists, as well as fake. There can be fake profiles. We've seen fake profiles on LinkedIn. We've seen fake profiles on pretty much every social media platform going. But often the fake profiles on LinkedIn are a way to actually go in and to either take away that individual's contacts or defraud them in some shape or form. You also understand filter bubbles and the notion of bias. Bias is something students learn much later on. And while they are in that little bubble, while they are closely connected to the social media tool or the app or whatever it is they're using, they may not be able to clearly see, actually, this is just for a group of students like you who look like this. And we are all different. And the bias that is existing across different apps is also alive and well. These are some of the reasons why both businesses and government are struggling to keep up, to understand how can they address these issues. But as professors, you also understand the theories behind those concepts, whether it's the notion of disintermediation, where the intermediary, the middle person, is taken away and replaced with a direct to access, whether it's network effect, which is why many of us are still, nearly grudgingly, but still using Twitter rather than using Blue Sky, because Blue Sky doesn't yet have the volume of people who are using the platform. So how can you actually respond? If we imagine you're live, you're in class, and you get a question. Are you using this? What do you think of this tool? My response to this is, That's a really interesting tool. Let's just explore that for a moment. Can you raise a hand if anybody else is using this tool? Then to understand the degree of usage and to understand if it's just a new tool or actually maybe it's essential. And maybe this is the point where you can happily say, you're not the target audience. This is a new one for me. Give me 3 reasons why I should adopt this tool. When you get those 3 reasons from the students, you might then discover that actually it's no different from other tools that exist. And this is where you can ask, well, can you sum this up in one sentence? If you just have to describe this to me in one sentence, how would you describe it? And oh, that sounds a lot like whether it's TikTok, that sounded a lot like Vine or Periscope. Is anybody still using? Does anybody remember Vine or Periscope? So how is it different? What are the different functions or features? And why is it better? What have they done that actually makes this tool worth investigating, worth subscribing to, or worth using? You might also wish to explore, well, what are the benefits of it? You've described the functions and features, fantastic. What does it contribute to and how? How does it improve my life? And if you think about the technology acceptance model and the umpteen variations of that, how is it useful for me? How does it help me in my work? And why will I be likely to use it? And then you can explore, well, what are the downsides of this? Because again, students may be very much focused on the upside, the positive aspects of this tool, and they may have forgotten that there could potentially be a downside. There were downsides early on of Instagram, which have since been fixed, which included the ability for Facebook, the parent at the time that is now Meta, being able to use all the imagery that you shared in part of its advertising campaigns, if it so desired. And in fact, a downside you could say of Twitter or X at the moment is every post that you make and every piece of content you add can be used to train X's new AI tool, Grok. So you're providing the content to train Grok, unless, of course, you opt out. And opting out is harder. This is where you have to explore in the settings to see how can you say, no, I don't actually want to share my content in that way. I think it's then worth exploring, well, what did we do before this came along? How did we communicate? How did we share images? How did we send videos? Was there a need to send videos? How did we do this beforehand? What did we do? And then have a look at, well, is there a group that it impacts negatively? To start to investigate the bias that might exist. And this again can make the students stop and think more about it. So by going through these questions, what you're doing is you're engaging with the students in a way that encourages them to critically consider and critically think about the tools that they may be using. They might know about all the tools, but they might not have thought about the consequences in full. And again, looking at, well, who benefits most from this? Is it the users? Is it the tech firms? And who's funding it? So what's the real motivation for the platform? What is it they're trying to do? And if anybody remembers Google Plus, we used Google Plus for a little while. And that was a tool that had you applied even the most basic technology acceptance model to it, Google probably wouldn't have gone ahead with it. I'm fairly sure that one day they realized they didn't have access to the degree of data that the social media platforms had. So they decided to create this new platform. And again, there are many platforms that start and that disappear. that don't actually stand the test of time because many of these issues haven't been fully investigated. One of the questions that was sent in beforehand, and thank you very much to those, several people actually sent through this same question about digital literacy. And they said, how can we actually assess student literacy, student digital literacy? There's a couple of really helpful tools. And these don't just look at the use of social media, but they look at their technical skills, whether it's being able to set up an Excel spreadsheet with pivot tables, or whether it's to be able to create a PowerPoint that perhaps follows accessibility guidelines, and to do those things. There's two tools I've mentioned here. One is the digital competence wheel. This provides a very nice graphic at the end. You go through the answers and it works. It's very mobile friendly. So it's one question, one answer per screen. And at the end, it provides a small colourful wheel that shows where your competencies are strong and where they are weak and may need improving. Europass is similar. It is longer and goes into a lot more detail. If I were using these in class, I'd probably use the digital competence wheel with first and second year students, and I'd probably use Europass with final year master's students who are looking for potentially going into the world of work afterwards. I've added on here for you, and you will get a copy of the slides and the recording at the end too. But I've added on a useful resource that I found from Education World called the 10 Digital Literary Resources for Teachers that I thought may be useful. So you can go into that classroom, you can explore their tools that they're mentioning, and then look at the critical thinking behind that. And then you could go into an exercise to actually assess digital literacy. In fact, I think one of these is included as one of the digital tools within the textbook Digital Business. So having looked at that broad landscape and addressed those questions, there's the big issue about AI. How do we use it? How are businesses using it? How can we as faculty use it? And how can students use it? Businesses are already using AI at many levels. However, I should say many of the tools for business do require a subscription. Even the paid for versions of ChatGPT or Claude, which is a better GPT system, the paid for versions are better because you're not sharing all your content, all your words, all your hard work with the general public, with absolutely everybody. One of the things that concerned me with Chat when it came out, because obviously Chat came out, I think it reached the same levels as social media, literally within about 5 days. It was very, very quick to gain attention. And Google weren't quite ready to release what's become, it was Bard and it became Gemini. It was rebranded as Gemini. And Microsoft's Copilot wasn't also ready at that time. But Chat was released very quickly. And then we discovered it has these things that they call hallucinations, which basically means it's creating content, completely made up content. But how can it be used usefully? I think for customer communication, where with chatbots, where people are asking questions, and it's taking it from a bag of words. But ideally, you use a closed GPT system. And that's what I meant about the paid for subscriptions, because that means all your rich data, all your content, which is actually your intellectual property, isn't shared with your competitors. There was one case, I think it was Samsung, where one of the product managers put the data sheet into, it may not have been Samsung, it could have been a completely different company. They put their product data sheets into chat to see how they could improve them. And a competitor firm in that same sector was looking for new information about data sheets. And this was in the early days of chat. And suddenly it was regurgitating the information that had been given free of charge by another product manager. So that's something to bear in mind. There may be AI tools that you're already using. You might be, like me, using Grammarly. In marketing, it's also used within HubSpot, which is a marketing tool that organizes lead generation and content. And effectively, it takes A/B testing to another level. So where, for example, a company historically would send out 2 newsletters, newsletter A and newsletter B, in a completely AI world where we still had algorithms, 10% of the database would be sent newsletters. 5% had newsletter A, 5% had newsletter B. And depending on what your measure of success was, whether that was the number of people opening the email, the number of people clicking on the link, whichever A or B was most successful within 24 hours, the remaining 90% of the database was sent the more successful email. There's also copywriting tools and image generation tools. You may already be using Canva as opposed to Canvas, the VLE. Canva has a free area where it can be useful to organize imagery for slides or for social media profiles as well. DAL will give you AI if you ask it for example, can I have an image of a super modern car in the 22nd century? It will create something for you. It may not be exactly what you need, and you go back and you refine your search until you reach the point that you get what you would like to use. However, the free side of these tools, again, those images become available for anybody else that wants to use them. Businesses are also using AI for processes, typically projects or team management. We all use different parts of teams, and you can nearly see where the autofill starts to happen within any of your Microsoft tools. When you're typing an email, it knows what you want to say next. And then data analysis, and I'll come back to data shortly to look at that in more detail. Identifying keywords on websites to understand how they can improve their performance within Google, and to gain social media insights. But all these tools pretty much would need to be paid for to get the real value for them. So it is only companies at particular levels that are able to get those insights. What we're not yet seeing, and I would hope we would see soon, we would start to see student access to some of these areas. Some do have them, and I'll mention those in a moment. And when I say how students can use AI, I think this probably should be called other ways students can use AI. Grammarly helps them to correct all those typographical errors. They may need to improve English and maths if they're, for example, or language skills and maths, if they are taking an apprenticeship program, or if they're keen to learn another language, and they may be, like me, using Duolingo. If you've got students where you set group projects, and if they're meeting up online, they can use tools such as Firefly, which has a free version, for note-taking. So they all get an accurate copy of the meeting notes. It may not be perfect, but they do get a copy of who said what and when, who contributed. And they may use chat for initial research, but I would suggest Perplexity is a little better, a little more sophisticated than chat and still has a free version. How can you use it? There are GPT detectors, and many universities are getting these built in to Turnitin. You can use it to brainstorm ideas, create diagrams, or for literature mapping. Research Rabbit is a quick way to actually do some literature mapping. There are other tools available. For teaching data analytics, a couple of things I wanted to mention here. Tableau has a public version. You do need to spend a little time on their site learning about Tableau, or you appoint students to learn about it and present it back into the class. There's also the Google Online non-profit marketing immersion challenge. This is where Google gives an allowance of £1,000 to £10,000, euros a month to non-profits that are registered with them, that are not in the education sector. Students are then invited to put in a request, build a team in order to help the organisations spend the money and run those campaigns. It's a bit challenging. I've used it for some years, and each year I get one or two student teams going through and using it. They have to persist, and I would recommend, if you are using it, to start early, because it takes quite a while for students to be matched with organisations, because there aren't enough non-profits or charities that are registered with them. So if you know any charities, do encourage them to do this. I mentioned bias and ethics earlier. There's an AI fairness tool that you might want to investigate and examine that. And again, that's another great potential student project that you could use to get them to look at the tools and to apply AI Fairness 360 to this. So how do you stay ahead? Well, two tools. I've been in this digital world since it started, mainly because I'm the generation that grew up with a fax machine that was going to change the world. And actually, it sort of did at the time. So I love all these new tools. There are so many websites and places you can visit. These are the two that it's easiest to look at. If you want to explore AI tools, I would suggest AI Explorer. It helps you to sort by sector, by subject, and you can sort the free and the paid for. So although it's got a top 10 list, many of them, some of the freemium tools, you've still got to give it a credit card to start with, which I'm very disinclined to do. And then I tend to use TechCrunch for my latest tech news. TechCrunch gives me access to the latest in social media, AI, digital, anything that's happening, new companies emerging, things to watch. So if I've only got time, and I'm sure, like me, you're really busy. If you've only got time for one or two tools, literally look at TechCrunch once every couple of weeks. Just jump into their homepage and you can click on what's new and you can consume that data, that information pretty quickly. There are some additional resources for you as well connected to the textbook. There's a teaching guide and I've outlined lesson plans in here. I've also put in there some class icebreakers that can be used whether you're teaching online or whether you're teaching face-to-face. These are especially good if you've got groups of students where they're very quiet and they may be a little bit reluctant to engage fully with a class, and that can be quite useful. But all the material that you need for the lesson plan is included within the textbook access online with Sage. And finally, if you'd like to connect with me, I use LinkedIn. I still sort of use X. I'm trying to use Blue Sky. I discovered Blue Sky recently. Actually, there's another way I stay ahead, which I forgot to mention on there. And probably because it's not a digital way of staying ahead. During COVID, I started buying a newspaper just one newspaper once a week, and that is the Financial Times Weekend. The FT Weekend always focuses on technology. And there was a journalist, Katie Martin, who was writing about Blue Sky. And I thought, this is really interesting. I haven't tripped over this yet. What is it? And I looked at it and I've set up my profile and I've set a few posts. It looks like Twitter used to look like, and it seems to be more a space for grown-ups. It just doesn't have the benefit of network effects yet. There aren't enough digital or business or marketing professors on there yet. So if you want to connect with me on any of those networks, please go ahead. Thank you all so much for being here today. I'm going to stop sharing and I will hand back to Eleanor.
Thank you, Annmarie. That was a really fascinating discussion and some really useful tips shared around how faculty can teach digital business nowadays. So we're now going into the Q&A part of our discussion. So please do add any questions you have into the Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen. I've seen that some are starting to come in. So while we wait for some more questions, we did have some submitted in advance. I think some of these have already been answered in your presentation. However, as at the end there, Annmarie, you were just discussing the key features of your book and how they can help. Somebody has asked, what are the recent topics you've had added into digital business?
Well, Digital Business is a brand new book, so it's all new. I should have had a copy in front of me. That would have been an intelligent thing to do, so I could refresh my brain. It has AI woven all the way through it, so it looks at the whole notion of digital business, the digital workplace, and it also looks at digital payments, product. So it looks at the 7 Ps from a digital aspect, but it also looks at the digital transformation and digital innovation as well. And I've taken in there some models, some research that I found from other academics. So I would also say, if there's anybody on the call who conducts research in this area, I would always welcome you sending me the details so that I could download what you've written about to include it in a next edition. Within the book, there's also spaces for what we call Discover More. And the Discover More is designed for students at a higher level, so maybe second, third year of university, master's level. And this encourages them to actually read more and learn more about a particular subject by directing them to a specific paper.
Great, thank you. I know the book also does include sections on AI, and obviously it's something you've discussed today as well. So that might be one area in answer to this question. But somebody's asked, what skills do students need to thrive in a rapidly evolving digital world, and how can educators address this in the curriculum?
That's a really excellent question. I think the biggest skill they need is communication. I think that's the single biggest skill that's actually needed. And the ability not just to be able to communicate via messages, but to communicate via presentations. Pretty much every job interview is on Teams or Zoom in some shape or form. So they need to be able to confidently and competently present online. They also need to be able to think critically and evaluate the tools they're using. And again, another thing that's in the book that changes, that always changes, is the area called digital tools. I think each chapter has 2 digital tools for students to explore and to examine more. And I think one of my favorites, and I think that might be in digital marketing, in the last edition of digital marketing, was Spot the Troll. So it would actually get students to take a quiz to see if they could distinguish between a probable fake profile that actually looked really genuine or and a genuine profile. So I think the critical skills, a digital competence in terms of the ability to use not just social media, because that's an application at a tactical level rather than at a strategic level. It's being able to present and to be able to use other tools, Google Analytics, the dashboard, as well as using Excel and those tools as well.
Yeah, fascinating. I think related to tools, there's been a lot of questions coming through on the chat now around that. Somebody has said that they have a challenge with delivering AI to organizations that don't allow their students to use AI. That's specifically for apprenticeship students, but I suppose it would be relevant generally. So how would you get around this?
Yeah, so that is a real challenge. What I would suggest they do, and again, I have students on my apprenticeship program where they're not allowed to use any open AI. It's banned. It's completely taken off the list. So either they're working in groups and they're working with others on that cohort to use it, or they may have some form of AI within their organization that they are using. So when they say they have no AI, they may have, if I think about students, say in insurance, financial services, those sectors where it would be completely prohibited for many reasons, they do have internal systems. So I would either get them to use, even Google as a search engine is actually using AI. So at a very, very basic level, Google is the ultimate machine learning tool. You put a search in, it comes up with responses. People no longer go to page 2, 3, 4, or 5 on Google. If they don't get the answer really high and early, as we call it, on the page, they then abandon the search or they refine the search. So effectively, what people are doing with Google is they're teaching it how it works, and they're going through a machine learning process and a prompt basis where they're refining and refining until they find what they're looking for. So I would say there is one tool that's probably snuck under the all the AI that is and isn't allowed in the organization. I suspect it's Google.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because I think people often forget about Google and the amount of AI functionality that does have embedded in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Um, Somebody else has said, as an academic misconduct officer, I find that AI tools are damaging learning. So organic learning, like organic food, will become a minority. What advice could you give for this in this regard?
It's a real challenge. Um, I'm absolutely sure I've seen work that's been created online, but the issue then is the student can't actually speak about the item confidently or competently. So we may return to the notion of a viva, and we may certainly at thesis level ask students and say on a sample basis, you'll be invited to a viva. Um, and I've seen poor work where either as an external examiner or in other spaces where students have said in a thesis document that this work is going to be a longitudinal study created over a decade. And you think, you've actually got 3, 4 months to do your thesis. You've copied and pasted that from somewhere. And the issue then is they're not reading or understanding the content that they're putting out there. So I think it's exploring it further. I think I mean, certainly at my university at Cranfield, we have an academic declaration that they declare at the beginning. And we take this very seriously. And if they declare that they haven't used AI, or if they have and they say, yes, I've used Grammarly, they've got to state what they've used and how they've used it and what for. So they've got to list all the tools. If they are on a sample basis invited for a viva, and they are unable to explain their thesis, there would be a misconduct case to answer there. And that would be the challenge. But it is an issue. Turnitin is improving and does have an AI bolt on. But of course, Turnitin Charge University is more for this. So it's not available everywhere at this moment in time, but it will happen. There are other AI tools that make it look like it wasn't written by AI, but we may end up doing another exercise or going back to exams and doing an exercise where at the beginning of term, students are asked to write a piece, and you've got their writing and you can see how they've constructed the sentences. And then you look at the end of term And if it's dramatically different, you can spot it. But I mean, I remember even in a pre-AI world, just in a general cheating world, just taking content. I took my first degree in French and linguistics, and the linguistics, I looked at language structure. So I can normally spot at 10 paces when something is slightly misaligned. And I was reading something a student had written. I thought, oh, this is really interesting. And then I thought, I like it because I wrote it. And then they'd had an exercise where they'd got to write, create a blog. And then later on, I was reading a piece of content and it was quite sweary. And I thought, this is really inappropriate language. And I thought, I know exactly who's written this. I found the exact article that was there. The student was effectively on that was an ex offence and was removed from the university.
Wow.
And I think as soon as that starts happening and people are aware of this, that this is actually a serious offence, this speaks to trust and honesty, and you won't get a reference from this. I think that becomes more important. It's about their personal authenticity.
Yeah, the different priorities that students have.
Mm.
I suppose that might answer this question. And that somebody's asked, is there any reliable free software for plagiarism and genuine ideas checking? But is that your answer, that it is becoming familiar with the content?
Yeah. Well, there's a couple of tools that I listed on what professors could use, the GPT detector, that actually came out literally hours after chat because they were already working on it. So you can use that and it will give you a likelihood score that it's, for example, 80% likely to have been created by this. And that's when you have the conversation with the students. But I think instead of finding students that are doing this, we need to nearly take a step back and we nearly need classes about ethics and authenticity and about your authentic self. Getting a good grade matters, but getting a grade based on your own merits and your own endeavors and your own hard work, that matters far more.
Yeah,
And
embedding
the
it.
idea to be able to say this was my original content is a very different thing.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Somebody else has asked, is it always a challenge? It is always a challenge to balance breakthrough technology against long-term trends within the business landscape. What are your views on how to balance this consideration within teaching?
It's another excellent question. I think it's looking at it at a strategic rather than a tactical level. There is another tool mentioned in the book is the Overdrive social media map. There's a company called Overdrive, and they plot this social media map every year. And I'd been collecting them for some years. And every year you saw all these tools that had just disappeared. I think it depends who the investors are. I think because that normally gives an indication as to whether it's going to really become a mainstream tool or will just merge. But I think at this moment in time, we're in an era where everybody's trying to create an AI tool or a digital tool and make millions from it. So there'll be hundreds and hundreds of tools made, like the dot-com bubble, which I remember well. And some of them will merge, some of them just won't get to the next round of funding. They'll disappear because they don't have usefulness. So how easy is it and again, it goes back to the technology acceptance model. How useful is it for me and how easy is it to use? So if it's clunky, difficult to use, Google Plus fell into that category. How useful is it? There was no real usefulness attached to Google Plus. Instagram, I'm not a major user. Twitter or X, it was my thing. Short posts rather than having to pick an image. How do I pick digital images all the time? It's challenging. So I end up just talking about books that I'm reading or just other things related, maybe about the university, but I'm not a heavy user of it. It's there, it's in the background, it's owned by Meta, it's probably going to stay around for some time. But I think businesses will wait until they see which way it's going and how useful it is for them. If it saves them time, effort, money, if it saves resources, they're more likely to adopt it.
Yeah, definitely. I think that links to this question, where somebody has asked, so there's a key challenge with teaching digital business in making it future-proof and context relevant, which obviously you've touched on. So can you give us some examples of how you address this challenge in your textbook, Digital Business, and suggestions of how to address that on our courses? It's very linked.
It's a brilliant question. It's always, I do wonder sometimes if I should have studied ancient history, because then I wouldn't be having to literally update everything all the time. What I tend to do is I work at a strategic level rather than the tactical tool level. You look at the functionality, the benefit, how does it enhance business? What does it do for business? So, for example, with the Internet of Things and how that's used in logistics and how that has been used um, to track and combined with blockchain, how that's actually been used to track shipments from one space to another so they could be accurately logged. That has real benefit. But most organizations who are looking at that, and if you were Hapag-Lloyd or one of these enormous companies, you would be investing that in a big way, but you'd probably have a technical specification for what you wanted. So you would be moving from this digitalization to digital transformation process, where it may already be a thing, but it's a paper-based, or it's based on lots of different pieces of software that you're bringing together in one thing. So to future-proof what you're teaching, if you focus on that higher, if you look at it from a higher level, from that strategic standpoint, rather than at the numbers and where we are with them at the moment. I do mention them in the book, and obviously that gets updated all the time, but I mention them in terms of context, in terms of there's all these platforms that are huge, and we have LinkedIn that's not even in that list. But actually, LinkedIn represents 200 of the 225 countries in the world, and most CEOs use LinkedIn. So use it within the broader context and at a strategic level. And that's exactly what I've done with the book, rather than getting into the tiny details and the minutiae about the specific programs. I'm not going to teach students how to make a TikTok video. That's not in the book. And if they want to do that, I'm sure they already know how to do that. But you've then got to think about what's the purpose of it? What should it contain in terms of the type of content? How long is it going to last? How quickly is it going to disappear? And that's one of the reasons many businesses are not necessarily using TikTok, is because the cost of making those videos and the shelf life they have is just too small. So the cost is too big, the shelf life is too small, which is why something like YouTube every day of the week works for business and tends to be an incredibly more sustainable tool.
Yeah. Yeah, I think this next person actually agrees with you, because they've said, how invested can we get in teaching AI, given how rapidly it's evolving and being integrated into all of our business apps? So G Workspace, Microsoft Office, etc., which are designed for users who haven't been taught to use it. So I suppose
Yeah.
it's the same answer as the previous
Yeah,
one.
it is. And I think, I mean, Copilot and G Workspace will evolve and will develop. And what they're really trying to do is make some things easier, but they don't always do that. I use Grammarly just for entertainment more than anything, but very often it changes the meaning of a sentence that I'm writing in an email. And I'm thinking, you really haven't understood that at all. It's still learning, but it is based on this huge bag of words that it's been given and the phrases. And when people say, yes, this is right, or no, it's not right, or they will use it, or they'll ignore it. And in the same way, these tools will help us and students will learn how to use them. But again, it's you go back to that strategic point about what is it you're trying to convey in that message, or what are you trying to do with that presentation?
Yeah, thank you. Somebody else has asked, would you advise lecturers to check the university's privacy policies or data policies before using publicly available tools with students? So thinking about strict EU data protection rules versus the US. And yeah, I suppose a really vital topic in that sense, making sure we're GDPR compliant.
Yeah, it's a really excellent question. Australia, they have the privacy principles, so does New Zealand. The US, privacy, in fact, the California CMA amended 2018, the California Privacy Act, the CPA, that actually was the foundation for GDPR. And California probably has the tightest rules than anywhere, and it's going through some amends at the moment. And we've got Digital Services Acts within the EU and within the UK. And even though the UK is no longer in the EU because of Brexit, we were very invested in GDPR, so we've kept that, and I think we probably will do. Ideally, your deans, your head of learning, maybe your head of your virtual learning environment, they should be advising what are the policies collectively, so that you don't need to make that decision. You don't want to be making that decision on your own. And again, I've reached out to say, what is our policy? And I asked our director of education, and it came back with the policies. This is we have a declaration. We don't have, I think we've got a working policy at the moment. We have a declaration, but this is where you have the Chartered Association of Business Schools, and they will be collectively working on those different policies as well. So I think don't try and reinvent the wheel. Do speak to your director of education to see what is there and share it with your colleagues. But those privacy legislation applies all over pretty much every country. There is a tool which may be in the book, which is a data privacy checker worldwide. So you can actually see the countries where it is and where it isn't.
Thank you. This next question says, in your experience, which company case studies prompt most engagement and interest from students?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. The case studies in the book are all new, and what I've done is I've tried to move away from the regular case studies. So you won't find Nike, you won't find Coca-Cola, you won't find Domino's Pizza in there. They're all very different. I take them from many different countries. And so I look at different countries that they may be less aware of, because this also contributes towards the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, where they might be investigating cases from locations they're less familiar with that can be quite interesting. I do have Spotify as an example for Sweden, but again, it gives the background to this. So each chapter contains 2 mini case examples, and then there's a running case all the way through the book.
Amazing. And while we're on the topic of the book, somebody else has said, what about employability? How do you address this in the book? And what are your best tips for students in navigating this evolving digitalization space?
Thank you. It's a brilliant question. And it's one that I thought about when I wrote my first book with Sage, digital marketing. I wrote the book that I wanted to be able to, that I needed to teach digital marketing. And I did the same with digital business. And typically a textbook at the beginning has all the intended learning outcomes, the ILOs. And under that, I've written 2 professional, I can't even remember what I call them. I should have had a copy of the book in front of me. I've got 2 professional goals that are there. So by the end of the chapter, students will have achieved these 2 professional outcomes, if you like. And they are taken directly from apprenticeship and slightly tweaked, but they're inspired by apprenticeship standards, and they're inspired by activities that employers ask students to do when they're recruiting. So the 2 professional objectives are worth looking at, and that's exactly what that was designed for. Thank you for asking the question. Brilliant question.
I think this next question links to that in sort of preparing this next generation for employment. Um, how can we ensure that students use AI responsibly to foster genuine intelligence and critical thinking rather than creating a superficially smart generation?
It's another brilliant question. I think it's about asking them those questions we looked at the beginning, um, where you say, well, that's a fantastic AI tool. Well, where does it come from? What does it do differently? How does that help? And what does it replace? And then also explore, well, who are the funders? Where did the investment come from? And is there any bias in there? Does it discriminate against specific groups of people in any way? And to have a look at that, and that starts to actually get them to think more critically about the tools they're using, rather than just like a little sheep, just thinking, oh, I'll use this tool because everybody else is using, but without understanding exactly what it is, where it comes from, and why it may or may not be acceptable. There was I don't know how many people on the call are using a social media platform called Truth Social. So this is one that was created by a former American president when he was kicked off another tool. And again, when you look at the bias within that platform, I joined for a short while and then it was just a bit of a toxic swamp from my perspective. So I left pretty quickly. It wasn't going to deliver anything useful for me. And I don't think it's grown the numbers that it thought. It hasn't got network effects. It hasn't got the numbers.
Thank you. We are running out of time, so just one last question. You obviously spoke about measuring digital literacy in your presentation slides. Someone specifically asked how you could measure AI literacy.
Do you know, who wants to do a research project? I think this is a brilliant research project. If anybody's interested in collaborating on this, I'd love to. Those tools are not there yet. I think they will be there. I'd love to do some research into this and explore it further.
Great. Thank you, Annmarie. Hopefully someone will take you up on that because it does sound like a really exciting
We could do it with a group
interest
from
area.
different countries and different places. That would be a really interesting thing to do, where we actually use some of the literacy tools to measure, maybe as a framework to measure AI literacy. It'd be a really nice, sticky, high impact paper as well.
Yeah, that would be amazing. And we have the PowerPoint slides that we'll be sharing, so you have Annmarie's contact details. So yeah, an exciting area for the future. So yes, thank you, Annmarie. That is all we have time for. And thank you everybody for your questions. We did have a lot come through, so I'm sorry that we didn't get to all of them, but Annmarie is going to aim to respond to these after the event, and then we'll circulate the answers to you. The link to the recording will also be circulated to everybody that attended and everybody that signed up and couldn't attend live today. And a final reminder that you can order your inspection copy or purchase your book using the discount code on the screen for 25% off Annmarie's amazing new book, Digital Business. So thanks again, Annmarie, for the fascinating discussion. And thanks everybody else for joining today.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.